The soft morning sun filtered through the windows of a modest living room, illuminating the quiet space where an elderly woman named Margaret sat in her favorite chair. The worn fabric of the armrests and the gentle creak of the wooden frame spoke of years of use, each mark a testament to a life lived with patience and resilience. Margaret, in her late 70s, adjusted her reading glasses as she leafed through an old photo album, her heart both heavy and hopeful as she paused on a picture of her beloved dog, Charlie. Charlie had been more than just a pet. He was Margaret's constant companion, a spirited and loyal toy poodle whose playful antics and sharp intelligence had brightened her days. With his curly coat and expressive eyes, Charlie had an air of charm that made him the darling of their small town. He had been by her side through thick and thin, bringing joy to her quiet life. But for the past 2 years, the house had been quieter, emptier. Charlie had gone missing one stormy evening, slipping through the yard gate during a particularly fierce thunderstorm. Margaret had searched tirelessly, enlisting the help of neighbors and posting flyers around town. She had visited the local animal shelter every week, hoping for a miracle. But as the months turned into years, hope began to fade. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop looking. The space beside her chair remained Charlie's. The leash still hung by the door, and the faint sound of his paws on the hardwood floors lingered in her memory. Outside, the season was shifting to late autumn. The air carried a crisp chill, and leaves in vibrant shades of orange and red blanketed the quiet streets of the small town. Margaret's days followed a predictable routine. Morning tea by the window, a slow walk to the nearby park, and afternoons spent tending to her garden. Each day was marked by the same ache of absence, a constant reminder of the bond she once shared with Charlie. That morning, Margaret's walk to the park was accompanied by a familiar sense of longing. The park was their favorite spot, a place where Charlie had chased squirrels, rolled in the grass, and greeted every passerby with his spirited bark and wagging tail. As she sat on a wooden bench under a canopy of golden leaves, her thoughts drifted back to those carefree moments. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and Margaret closed her eyes, allowing the sounds of nature to soothe her. Her neighbor, Harold, joined her on the bench, carrying a warm cup of coffee in his hands. Harold, a retired postman with a kind heart and a penchant for storytelling, had been a steadfast presence in Margaret's life. "Thinking about Charlie again?" he asked gently, his voice carrying a note of understanding. Margaret nodded, a wistful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I just can't let go of the hope," she admitted. "It's been 2 years, but I still feel like he's out there somewhere." Harold placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "If anyone can find their way back, it's Charlie," he said. "That dog has more spirit than most people I know." His words, though well-meaning, felt bittersweet. Margaret often wondered if she was holding on to something that was no longer possible. But a part of her refused to give up. Charlie had been her lifeline, and she wasn't ready to let go of the belief that their story wasn't over. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Margaret decided to head home. She bid Harold goodbye and made her way back, her thoughts still consumed by memories of Charlie. The walk was quiet, save for the crunch of leaves beneath her shoes, and by the time she reached her front door, the air had grown colder. Inside, Margaret prepared her evening tea, her movements slow but steady. She settled into her chair, the photo album still open on the table beside her. A picture of Charlie as a playful puppy caught her eye, and she traced the outline of his curly fur with her finger, a lump forming in her throat. Her reverie was broken by the faint sound of barking in the distance. Margaret paused, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was familiar, achingly so, and it stirred something deep within her. She set down her cup and moved toward the window, her hands trembling as she peered outside. The street was empty, the sound fading as quickly as it had come. Margaret sighed, her heart heavy with disappointment. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, a spark of hope ignited by the fleeting sound. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, one that lingered as she returned to her chair. That night, as Margaret drifted off to sleep, her thoughts were filled with images of Charlie, his wagging tail, his joyful bark, and the way his presence had made everything feel a little brighter. Unbeknownst to her, the wheels of fate were already in motion, setting the stage for a reunion she could never have imagined. The next morning, Margaret awoke with the faint sound of barking still echoing in her mind. It had been so vivid the night before, as though Charlie's voice had found a way to reach her across time and distance. She shook off the thought, telling herself it was just a dream, but the feeling of hope lingered, pulling at her heart. After breakfast, Margaret decided to visit the animal shelter. It was a ritual she had carried out every week since Charlie had gone missing, though the visits had become bittersweet. Each time, she walked in hoping to see her beloved poodle, only to leave with a heavy heart. But today felt different. There was a lightness in her step, as though some unseen force was guiding her. When she arrived at the shelter, the staff greeted her warmly. They knew her well, often exchanging sympathetic smiles as she scanned the rows of kennels. "Morning, Margaret," said Sarah, a kind woman with a clipboard in hand. "Still looking for Charlie?" Margaret nodded, her expression soft but determined. "I'll never stop," she replied. "Not until I know." Sarah offered a reassuring smile. "We got a few new arrivals yesterday. Feel free to take a look." Margaret walked slowly through the shelter, her eyes scanning each kennel. The sound of barking and the occasional wagging tail filled the air, but none of the dogs were Charlie. Her heart sank slightly with each step, but she reminded herself that hope was a journey, not a destination. As she reached the last row, a small dog with curly fur caught her eye. For a fleeting moment, her heart leapt, but as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't Charlie. Still, she knelt by the kennel, offering the dog a comforting smile. "You're a sweet one," she said softly. "I hope you find your home soon." On her way out, Margaret stopped by the front desk to thank Sarah. "No luck today," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "Actually, Margaret, something came up yesterday that I meant to mention. A small poodle was brought in, but he wasn't in great shape. Looked like he'd been wandering for a long time. He was taken to the vet for some care, but they're bringing him back this afternoon. Could you come by later?" Margaret's heart raced. "A poodle?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think it could be him?" Sarah shrugged, her expression cautious but hopeful. "I can't say for sure, but it's worth checking. Why don't you come by around 3? Margaret nodded, her hands gripping her purse tightly. "I'll be here," she said, her voice firm. The hours until 3 o'clock passed agonizingly slowly. Margaret busied herself with small tasks around the house, but her mind kept wandering back to the shelter. She tried to temper her expectations, reminding herself that it might not be Charlie, but her heart refused to listen. For the first time in months, the spark of hope burned brightly within her. When the clock finally struck 3, Margaret hurried back to the shelter. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the door, her eyes immediately searching for Sarah. The staff member spotted her and walked over with a gentle smile. "You're just in time," she said. "They've brought the dog in. Let me take you to him." Margaret followed Sarah down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, a mixture of hope and fear weighing her down. When they reached the examination room, Sarah paused and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "He's been through a lot," Sarah said softly. "But take a look. Maybe it's him." Margaret stepped inside, her breath catching as she saw the small, curly-haired dog lying on a padded bed. His fur was matted and his body looked frail, but his posture was unmistakable. He lifted his head weakly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Charlie," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he let out a soft whine. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch him. The dog sniffed her hand, his movements slow but deliberate, before pressing his nose into her palm. "It's you," she sobbed, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and joy. "It's really you." Charlie let out a soft bark, his tail wagging weakly as he leaned into her touch. The years of separation melted away in that moment, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and relief. Margaret held him close, her tears soaking into his fur as she whispered words of gratitude and comfort. Sarah watched from the doorway, a smile spreading across her face. "I'll give you two some time," she said quietly before stepping out. Margaret stroked Charlie's fur gently, her voice soft as she spoke to him. "I've missed you so much, my boy. I never stopped looking, and I never stopped believing you'd come back to me." Charlie's tail wagged again, stronger this time, as though he understood every word. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret felt whole. The bond they shared had endured, even across the vast distance and time that had separated them. Margaret stayed with Charlie for what felt like hours, her hands never leaving his soft, curly fur. The shelter's quiet examination room became a cocoon of warmth and love, the world outside fading as she focused solely on her long-lost companion. Charlie's fragile frame and tired eyes told a story of hardship, but the wag of his tail and the way he leaned into her touch revealed a spirit that hadn't been broken. "You've been through so much," Margaret murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you're home now, Charlie. I promise you'll never have to go through that again." Charlie let out a small whimper, his nose nuzzling against her hand. It was as if he was saying, "I know. I'm safe now." Sarah returned after some time, carrying a clipboard and a soft blanket. "I've spoken with the vet," she said gently. "He's malnourished and needs some care, but they're optimistic about his recovery. With some love and the right attention, he'll bounce back." Margaret nodded, her determination clear. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want him to be happy again." Sarah smiled, handing Margaret the blanket. "I know he's in good hands. Let's get the paperwork sorted and you can take him home." The process felt surreal, each signature on the form solidifying the reality of the moment. Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude as she carried Charlie out of the shelter, wrapped snugly in the blanket. He rested quietly in her arms, his body relaxing as if he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The walk home was slow, every step deliberate as Margaret whispered words of reassurance to Charlie. The familiar sights and sounds of the neighborhood seemed to comfort him, his ears perking up at the sound of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. By the time they reached the cottage, Charlie's tail was wagging faintly, his trust in Margaret already rekindling. Inside, Margaret carefully set Charlie down on a soft cushion near the fireplace. The room glowed with warmth, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. She brought over a bowl of water and a small plate of food, watching as Charlie ate slowly, his movements tentative but grateful. "You're safe now, my boy," she said softly, sitting beside him. "This is your home, and I'll never let you go again." Over the next few days, Margaret devoted herself to Charlie's care. She adjusted her routines to accommodate his needs, waking early to prepare his meals and spending hours gently brushing his fur, untangling the knots and restoring its soft, curly texture. Each small act of care was a step toward healing for both of them. Charlie's strength began to return, and so did his spirit. He started following Margaret around the house, his little paws clicking on the hardwood floors as he stayed by her side. The sound, once only a memory, now filled the quiet cottage again, bringing a sense of joy Margaret hadn't felt in years. Their first walk to the park after his return was an emotional milestone. Margaret watched with a mixture of pride and tears as Charlie sniffed the familiar grass and wagged his tail at passers-by. Harold, sitting on his usual bench, waved them over, his face lighting up as he spotted Charlie. "Well, look who it is," Harold exclaimed, his voice brimming with delight. "I told you he'd find his way back." Margaret laughed, her eyes glistening with tears. "You were right, Harold. He's home." Charlie barked softly, his tail wagging as Harold reached out to pet him. The three of them sat together, the golden leaves swirling around them like a celebration of the reunion. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret felt whole, her heart filled with gratitude for the miracle of having Charlie back in her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Margaret and Charlie walked home together, their steps perfectly in sync. The bond they shared was stronger than ever, a testament to the love and loyalty that had endured through their time apart. The days that followed were a quiet celebration of healing and reconnection. Charlie's energy grew with each passing moment, and his once fragile frame began to fill out with the care and love Margaret poured into him. Every meal she prepared, every gentle stroke of his curly fur, was a promise that their separation was truly over. One evening, as the golden hues of sunset bathed the cottage in a soft glow, Margaret sat on the porch with Charlie curled up at her feet. The rhythmic creak of the rocking chair and the gentle hum of crickets filled the air. Margaret looked down at Charlie, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in peaceful contentment. "You've brought life back to this home, Charlie," she said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed you until you were gone." Charlie's ears twitched at her voice, and he looked up at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to hold an entire world of understanding. His tail wagged softly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Margaret's neighbors had all noticed the change in her since Charlie's return. The once muted energy that had surrounded her had been replaced with a quiet joy. Harold, in particular, marveled at how much brighter Margaret seemed. "That dog of yours is something special," he remarked during one of their morning walks. "He's brought you back to life." Margaret smiled, watching as Charlie trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he greeted a passing jogger. "He's always been special," she replied. "I just didn't realize how much until I almost lost him." Their daily routines became a source of happiness for the entire community. Children in the neighborhood would rush to greet Charlie, laughing as he wagged his tail and gave soft, excited barks. Even the local shopkeepers had treats ready for him whenever Margaret stopped by. Charlie had become more than just a dog. He was a symbol of resilience and love, a reminder of the extraordinary bonds that animals and humans could share. One afternoon, as Margaret tended to her garden, Charlie patted over with something in his mouth. It was a small, weathered tennis ball, one of his favorite toys from before he'd gone missing. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized it. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she took the ball from him. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Charlie barked softly, his tail wagging as he nudged her hand with his nose. It was as if he were saying, "It's a part of our story, just like everything else." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she hugged him tightly, the old ball clutched in her hand. The moment was a poignant reminder of how much they had endured and how far they had come. Charlie had brought more than joy back into her life. He had brought a sense of completeness, of having something to hold on to even in the face of loss. That evening, Margaret placed the ball on the mantel above the fireplace, where it joined the framed photos of her family and the memories of a life well lived. It was a small but powerful symbol of hope, a reminder that even after years of longing and uncertainty, love had a way of finding its way back. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret and Charlie sat together by the fire. She stroked his fur, her heart full of gratitude for the second chance they had been given. "You've always been my heart, Charlie," she whispered, "and you always will be." Charlie responded with a soft bark, his head resting on her lap. In that moment, the world felt perfect, simple, peaceful, and filled with a love that neither time nor distance could diminish. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret and Charlie fell back into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Their walks through the park, once shadowed by longing and sadness, were now filled with laughter and the joy of rediscovery. Neighbors often stopped to marvel at their bond, commenting on how Charlie seemed like a new dog, though Margaret knew it was the same loyal soul she'd loved all along. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the park, Harold approached with a small camera in hand. "Margaret," he said, his voice full of warmth, "may I take a picture of you and Charlie? The whole town's been talking about your story. I think it's something we'll all remember." Margaret chuckled softly, glancing down at Charlie, who wagged his tail as though he understood every word. "Of course," she replied, crouching beside her beloved poodle. She wrapped an arm around him, his curly fur brushing against her cheek as she smiled. Harold snapped the photo, capturing a moment of pure happiness. "Perfect," he said, grinning. "You two are an inspiration." Margaret looked at Harold thoughtfully. "It's not just our story," she said. "It's a reminder that love, true love, never gives up. It finds a way, no matter how long it takes." As Harold walked away, Margaret felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Charlie had returned to her life when she needed him most, and his presence had reignited a spark she thought she'd lost forever. Together, they had weathered storms, endured separation, and emerged stronger for it. That evening, Margaret placed the new photo on her mantel, right beside the old tennis ball. It stood as a testament to their journey, a reminder of the love that had endured, unshaken by time or distance. As she gazed at it, her heart swelled with a profound sense of peace. By the fireplace, Charlie lay on his favorite cushion, his eyes half closed as he basked in the warmth of the flames. Margaret knelt beside him, her hands gently stroking his fur. "You've given me so much, Charlie," she said softly. "More than I could ever repay. But I'll spend the rest of my days trying." Charlie's tail wagged in response, his head resting against her arm. His quiet contentment mirrored Margaret's own, their bond unspoken yet undeniable. As the night deepened, the cottage grew quiet, the soft hum of the fire the only sound. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, Charlie curled up at her feet. The years of longing and uncertainty felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the steady rhythm of love and trust that defined their life together. For Margaret, Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was her heart, her joy, and her miracle. And for Charlie, Margaret was his everything, the anchor that had guided him home. Together, they were a testament to the enduring power of. If this heartfelt story of reunion and unconditional love moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's celebrate the incredible bond between humans and their furry companions.